Americans were leaving capsules filled with infected ticks beside railway tracks. Finnish tourists were throwing similar test tubes out of bus windows. Chinese saboteurs were scattering glass spheres across Siberia. The spheres supposedly focused sunlight and started forest fires. And before the 1980 Moscow Olympics, foreign agents were releasing infected mice onto city streets. Today, all of this sounds like a collection of absurd conspiracy theories. But in the Soviet Union, stories like these were often repeated with complete seriousness. They circulated among adults, spread by word of mouth, appeared in the media, and eventually found their way into children's horror stories. In their book, Dangerous Soviet Things, Urban Legends and Fears in the USSR, folklorists and anthropologists Alexandra Arkhipova and Anna Kirzuk collected and examined the stories Soviet people used to frighten one another. But where did these strange fears come from? To understand that, we need to return to the early 1950s, to the Korean War, and the alleged American plague bombs. On June 25, 1950, Communist North Korean forces crossed the border into South Korea. The Korean War had begun. North Korea was supported by China and the Soviet Union. China sent hundreds of thousands of so-called People's Volunteers to the front. The USSR supplied weapons, military advisors, and pilots, whose participation was not officially acknowledged at the time. South Korea was supported by an international force operating under United Nations command. The overwhelming majority of those troops were American. The Second World War had ended only 5 years earlier, and memories of Japan's biological warfare program were still fresh. The infamous Unit 731 had experimented on human beings and studied methods of spreading plague, cholera, and other infectious diseases. Japan had been an ally of Nazi Germany, and after its defeat, some of the program's specialists and research materials came into American hands. The idea that the next war might involve biological weapons did not seem entirely impossible. In 1951, and especially in 1952, North Korea and China accused the United States of using biological weapons. The Soviet Union actively supported the allegations. Chinese newspapers published numerous photographs of small, unidentified black insects, supposedly dropped from American aircraft. The Soviet press was not far behind. During the same period, Soviet publications claimed that American saboteurs were deliberately spreading the Colorado potato beetle across Europe and the Soviet Union. Today, the Colorado beetle is simply known as a destructive agricultural pest, but Soviet propaganda sometimes presented its spread as a possible act of Western sabotage. The insect was even called the six-legged ambassador of American imperialism. The Colorado beetle was soon joined by even more frightening stories. Bombs that released plague-infected flies on impact, or typhoid injections supposedly administered to local people under the guise of medical treatment. In the spring of 1952, the Leningrad newspaper Smena ran headlines such as "American servicemen confirm the use of bacteriological weapons by American aggressors," and "American interventionists continue to commit monstrous crimes." The party and the government organized meetings at Soviet factories devoted to the war in Korea. Workers were told about the treachery of the American military. Resolutions condemning the use of biological weapons by American aggressors were then read aloud and formally approved. Correspondents claimed that American aircraft were dropping bombs filled with plague-carrying flies. One report described yellow leaves infected with bacteria. Another mentioned 4 containers filled with flies, fleas, and spiders carrying dangerous diseases. The United States government categorically denied the allegations. Suspicion was intensified by the fact that an American military medical facility known as the 406th Medical General Laboratory, really did exist in Tokyo. The laboratory studied infectious diseases. Its existence did not, of course, prove that the United States was using biological weapons, but the Soviet press could easily portray it as a secret facility creating new epidemics. After photographs of the small black insect saboteurs were published, American entomologists attempted to identify the creatures in the images. Some of the mysterious insects turned out to be completely harmless marsh springtails. Another unidentified creature, supposedly infected with meningitis, was an ordinary mosquito whose wings had been torn off. Yet its strange appearance was itself presented as evidence that a secret American laboratory had created a new species, capable of spreading disease. The United States proposed an international investigation involving the Red Cross and the World Health Organization. China and North Korea rejected the proposal, claiming that these organizations were under Western influence. Instead, an international scientific commission was sent to China and North Korea by the World Peace Council, an organization closely aligned with the Soviet Union. It was not a United Nations commission, as is sometimes claimed. The commission was led by Joseph Needham, a prominent British biochemist and historian of Chinese science. Its members examined witness testimony, medical evidence, insect specimens, and what were said to be fragments of biological weapons. The commission ultimately supported the allegations and concluded that the United States had indeed used biological warfare. Critics, however, pointed out that the investigators were operating under conditions entirely controlled by the Chinese and North Korean authorities. They could not freely select the sites they visited, and depended heavily on witnesses and evidence supplied by their hosts. The Commission's conclusions therefore became an immediate subject of international controversy. While Stalin was alive, publicly questioning the existence of American plague bombs was virtually impossible in the Soviet Union. But after his death in March 1953, the Soviet leadership's attitude toward the story suddenly began to change. Lavrentiy Beria, who was then serving as the Soviet Minister of Internal Affairs, received several secret reports from Soviet specialists who had worked in North Korea. According to copies of these documents published decades later, the specialists reported that they had found no convincing evidence that biological weapons had been used. More seriously, North Korean officials had allegedly asked Soviet advisors to help create the appearance of infected areas. The documents mentioned fabricated epidemic zones, staged funerals, and attempts to obtain cultures of plague and cholera bacteria. One North Korean official allegedly went so far as to suggest infecting prisoners who had been sentenced to death. Their bodies could then be presented to foreign investigators as evidence of an epidemic. Beria later wrote to Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov that the entire campaign had caused serious political damage to the Soviet Union. The documents remained classified and did not become public until the 1990s. Some historians consider them evidence that the allegations against the United States were part of a major propaganda operation. But the controversy has never been settled completely. What was published consisted not of the original archival documents, but of handwritten copies whose provenance cannot be fully verified. It is also known that the United States had an active biological weapons program in the early 1950s. Nevertheless, no direct and generally accepted proof that American forces used biological weapons during the Korean War has ever been found. Most modern historians consider the allegations either unproven or deliberately fabricated. The Soviet public, however, knew nothing about the secret reports. The story of the plague-carrying flies continued to live on in newspapers, in propaganda, and in the popular imagination. For us, the more important question is why the story of infected insects seems so believable. It was accepted not only by ordinary readers of Pravda, the official newspaper of the Soviet Communist Party, but also by some foreign intellectuals and left-wing political activists. The Soviet press referred to these sympathetic foreigners as members of the progressive international public. First, Cold War propaganda constantly demonized the enemy. Soviet citizens were repeatedly told that capitalist countries, led by the United States, were capable of committing any crime, no matter how cruel or elaborate. If the Americans were already dropping Colorado beetles, why wouldn't they start releasing flies infected with plague? Second, this artificial, or at least heavily exaggerated, story followed the structure of much older folklore. During epidemics, people have often tried to identify a specific person or group to blame. In medieval Europe, for example, Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells and spreading the plague. Something complex and invisible, an infection, was transformed into a simple story about an enemy who had deliberately brought the disease. It's hardly surprising, then, that official propaganda gradually became genuine popular folklore. By the 1970s and 1980s, full-fledged urban legends were circulating across the Soviet Union about enemies using biological weapons against the country. During the construction of the Baikal-Amur main line, people told stories about Americans leaving capsules filled with dangerous ticks beside the railway tracks. The Baikal-Amur main line, usually called BAM, was one of the largest and most heavily promoted construction projects of the late Soviet period. Thousands of young people traveled to sparsely populated parts of Siberia and the Soviet Far East to build a new railway through extremely difficult terrain. And according to the rumors, suspicious capsules could be found along the route. You find one of these little capsules, and there's cotton inside with tiny black dots. Those are ticks the Americans have dropped here. In Leningrad, present-day St. Petersburg, tourists from neighboring Finland were supposedly doing exactly the same thing. People claim that Finns came to the city to drink cheap Soviet vodka, while secretly throwing test tubes filled with encephalitis-carrying ticks out of their tour buses. But why the Finns? Finland shared a border with the Soviet Union, yet remained a market economy with close ties to the West. Finnish visitors were a visible and somewhat mysterious presence in everyday Leningrad life. Foreigners in general inspired both curiosity and suspicion. They brought unusual clothes, foreign products, and hard currency. But in rumors, they could easily be transformed into spies or saboteurs. An ordinary tourist bus therefore became the perfect vehicle for a secret biological attack. According to another rumor, Chinese saboteurs were operating along the Trans-Siberian Railway. They were supposedly scattering small glass spheres throughout the forest. The spheres were said to refract sunlight, focus it on a single point, and start wildfires. Stories like this offered a simple explanation for enormous forest fires, whose causes and scale an ordinary person had no way of investigating. The forest was not burning because of extreme heat, lightning, or human carelessness. It had been deliberately set on fire by an identifiable enemy who had left behind a clear piece of physical evidence, a glass sphere. According to the rumors, biological saboteurs appeared even before the 1980 Moscow Olympics. The games were intended to show the world a modern, welcoming, and secure Soviet Union. At the same time, the expected arrival of thousands of foreigners increased fears of spies, provocations, and sabotage. Stories began circulating about mice scattering through Moscow courtyards. They called the public health service. It turned out the mice were infected. Some foreigners had released them. In the Soviet Union, the Sanitary and Epidemiological Service was responsible for controlling infectious diseases, inspecting public hygiene, and dealing with dangerous animals and insects. The rumor offered no further details. Who had infected the mice? What disease were they carrying? Where had they been examined? None of that mattered. The important words were, it turned out they were infected. The idea of biological sabotage could also be used to teach children not to pick up unfamiliar objects from the street. One of the people interviewed by the researchers remembered bringing home a metal ball she had found outside in the early 1980s. Her grandmother immediately took it away and flushed it down the toilet, explaining that it might be a piece of biological weaponry dropped by the Americans. Perhaps the grandmother did not entirely believe her own explanation, but it was much more effective than a simple warning. The unfamiliar object was no longer merely dirty or potentially dangerous. It could be part of a secret operation against the Soviet Union. The Soviet media also talked extensively about the psychological warfare supposedly being waged against the USSR by capitalist countries, led by the United States. By the late 1950s, this idea had merged with fears of biological and chemical weapons. People began to imagine a substance capable of altering the human mind, suppressing a person's will, destroying their intelligence, and turning them into an obedient but aggressive servant. This particular fear did not produce as many urban legends, but it found its way into Soviet cinema. 2 films dealing with the idea were released in 1968, Dr. Abst's Experiment and The Dead Season. Both featured secret laboratories in which former Nazi scientists, or their post-war successors, developed substances capable of controlling human behavior. The Dead Season became particularly well known. In the film, a former Nazi doctor develops a gas designed to strip people of their intelligence, memory, and free will. The goal is to turn human beings into an obedient and easily controlled mass. For a Cold War audience, this was not merely science fiction. The story continued a familiar idea. Somewhere in the West, a secret laboratory was creating an invisible weapon to use against ordinary people. Stories about infected insects, foreign saboteurs, and secret laboratories survived both the Soviet Union and the turbulent 1990s. The countries, enemies, and diseases changed, but the basic structure remained the same. Something frightening and difficult to understand takes place. Finding the real cause is complicated. Imagining a secret group that planned everything in advance is much easier. These legends make an invisible threat visible. An epidemic becomes a capsule filled with ticks. A forest fire becomes a glass sphere. An unknown disease becomes a mouse released by a foreign agent. That's why the story of the American plague flies became more important than the propaganda campaign that created it. Even after the newspaper articles had been forgotten, the image they created remained alive. Danger could be hiding anywhere, inside an insect, an abandoned toy, a tourist bus, or an ordinary mouse. What strange urban legends did you hear when you were growing up? Tell us in the comments.